For much of the world, it now seemed like the cat was very much out of the bag, and that countries not already besieged by the undead should at least be listening to the rest of the world and making the proper preparations. But unfortunately, many countries were slow on the uptake, and Bob Archer informs us just why. Formerly working for the CIA, Archer laments that they, unfortunately for the Americans in this case, weren't the shady, omniscient Argus of America handing out assassinations and coups left, right and centre, but far poorer staffed and less efficient than many believed, though it suited them to reinforce their intimidating image. However, this did lead to not inconsiderable blame when they let an undead horde eat over 2/3 of the country. The zombies managed to slip in partially from being unexpected, and partially because China had pretty successfully led them on a wild goose chase. With its own outbreaks spiralling and becoming more serious, to cover its tracks and save face, the Chinese government began an elaborate faux war with Taiwan. Knowing they were already top of the CIA watch list and that someone was onto them, they didn't deny half of what they were doing, but simply lied about why they were doing it. Destroying what we now know were infected civilians was played off as cracking down on dissidents, with disappearances and executions. A defense minister was assassinated. There were skirmishes in the Straits. It all led to America's belief that they were on the cusp of seeing World War III. And in a way, they were right. They were ultimately so preoccupied with that they hand-waved reports of infected from other countries. Who cared about some non-consensual nibbling among the populace when a war was brewing? The influential Warmbrun Night Report was one such hand-waved document, and Archer later found it in the desk of a clerk 3 years after the events known as the Great Panic. Although personally he tried to downplay its importance, saying that by the time of the publication the facts were already out, it was just who'd believe them that was the more pressing issue. On the other side of the pond, overseeing the yearly Z-sweep as things thaw out in Finland, Allied Commander Travis D'Ambrosia has some clear regrets. Like many others, the government had a stifled approach to admitting that such an unlikely threat could be true, saying how it felt like a relief, or a dam breaking, when they could finally discuss what scattered reports had been saying for months, that the dead had risen. D'Ambrosia similarly admits he didn't see the Warmbrun Night Report until considerably after the Great Panic, but tries to claim it was similar to what was being planned anyway. The US plan was split into 2 phases. Phase 1 was swift and efficient and has seemingly been regarded as a success by all who talk about it. The Alpha Teams. A fancy name for inserting small special forces teams into infected areas, with the 3-pronged goal of investigate, isolate and eliminate the undead. D'Ambrosia is very proud of the Alpha Teams, but they were only ever an attempt at slowing the undead creep. There are only so many special forces available, and as the infection continued, the notion of trying to put out individual fires became untenable, even if it's believed they were slowing things down. The second phase of the plan was ambitious, to say the least, essentially putting as much of the civilian population through basic training, and then arming and equipping them to make them suitable for the front lines. Perhaps it was too ambitious, as not only was it never completed, but it was never properly started either. Overall, it seems the top officials got cold feet about the procedure, with the unlikelihood of its success. At the time, the US had much of its morale eroded by Afghanistan and Iraq, and especially failing to deliver a spectacular and definitive victory to celebrate, which is what the public wanted. Opinion had turned against the military, and such struggles were seen as a waste of time, money and lives. So with a monstrously expensive task ahead and little chance of convincing a civilian populace that wasn't already enlisted to join in, Phase B never really got off the ground. D'Ambrosia views public support as a finite national resource, and the government and army had squandered it and were deeply in debt. He doesn't blame the public, but more the higher officials for this abuse of power. One such official is Grover Carlson. The former White House Chief of Staff now picks up cowpats for biofuel, and is dismissive of just about all the build-up prior to the penny dropping. He actually had a copy of the Warnbro Night Report, calling it the Night Warned Yous Report, and viewed it as typical alarmist crap. In his and the president's eyes, it was some new nutcasery to join global warming and other bleeding heart concerns they always seemed to be claiming was bringing about the coming apocalypse. According to Carlson, they were lucky to even get the alpha teams, as well as an educational video and some changes to the briefing of local law enforcement. Said local law enforcement wanted more personnel trained and more equipped to deal with the undead, but whatever, they always wanted that anyway, and the military too. Their complaints weren't anything they hadn't been brushing off for years already. To the public, they were also pretty keen just to lie. Despite the clear intel of the Warnbro Night Report, they were still happy to call the virus African rabies. They had what they already knew as a useless placebo to keep people calm, and it was a nice, mostly manageable sounding disease that didn't explode into a series of riots and protests, especially when they had an election year as well. They needed a nice, happy voter base to keep them in Washington, not scared people asking about the hordes of the undead. With winter rolling in to literally freeze outbreaks and existing zombies temporarily, and the comfort of the placebo phalanx in people's minds, the news moved on to fresher and less repetitive stories. Through luck, the season, the reasonable success of the alpha teams, and a fake vaccine, most of America had all but forgotten about Solanum by the time of spring. Grover views anyone still concerned about the undead that would ultimately devour the nation and permanently change the trajectory of humanity's existence, at that point, some overeducated elitist egghead. As far as he's concerned, the government had a lot on their plate, and did what they could. Ultimately, it turned out to be nowhere near enough. In Antarctica, we meet Breckenridge Scott. He hasn't left his polar base since the Great Panic, when he was drawn by the remoteness and the freezing temperatures. As we find out, he's more than capable of affording such a Bond villain level of luxurious absurdity. Scott was the man who came up with the idea of phalanx, a key factor in reducing American defences against the undead. Scott claims he barely even understands economics all that well, but his chief lesson is that fear is what sells. He believes companies don't sell you products, they sell the fear of you having to live without their products. And when he saw that first, typically overblown and hyperbolic scaremongering news report about African rabies, all he could see was profit. And the idea was phalanx. Phalanx was a vaccine. On paper, this was technically true, as it was still an actual rabies vaccine, but Solanum itself has no cure or vaccine, and so phalanx was of course useless for the actual virus itself. A cure people would buy only if they thought they were infected, but a vaccine was preventative, again selling the fear of living without the product in an era of scaremongering. The president at the time lapped it up too. Barely aware if it worked, it sold the peace of mind needed to boost his campaign. And being the hero to dot the I's and cross the T's on what many believe to be a successful vaccine to the evil jungle fever was exactly what was needed. Even Scott admits he didn't actually expect Solanum to be as bad as it was, starting off with the belief that this was just another disease scare shake-up for America, like SARS or bird or swine flu. At the start, it seemed like an opportunity for easy money. And safe money too, all things considered. As said, phalanx was still a rabies vaccine. If anyone asked, they'd just been following the initial reports that it was a strain of rabies. How were they to know it was actually a completely distinct zombie virus? And it had been tested in Europe as promised too. Just not on anyone that was actually infected with a disease called African rabies at the time. But still. On top of that, it was a prescription drug, and had been stamped by the White House itself. They could blame Scott all they wanted, but there was still a lot of fingerprints on the gun too. Phalanx had immense public support. Someone was apparently bitten, but lived and claimed it was due to Phalanx. There was so much investment in it, Scott makes the somewhat dubious claim that it ended the recession. In fact, he continues to argue that he did nothing wrong, and that it was the reporter that busted him, and showed Phalanx as useless, who is the real villain. The ensuing meltdown combined with zombie attacks, he argues, led to the Great Panic. Or the president for signing it, or the media for calling it rabies when it wasn't, or the customers themselves for not doing sufficient research. Everyone but him, really. Scott still believes all he did was just make some money, and has nothing to apologise for. This is, of course, debatable. However, Scott isn't wrong to say a lack of education was one of the major killers in regards to the Great Panic, and the success of Phalanx. Health literacy, the accessibility, understanding and application of valid information relating to health, is a key part of combating any epidemic, and surveys show that in some countries it's actually pretty lacking. Incorrect information leads to incorrect decisions that can sometimes be fatal, with people trying to self-administer phony cures. Even if it's questionable people would have leapt onto Phalanx as they did, with what we now know about vaccine hesitancy, there's no doubt a lack of health literacy is a major issue in any pandemic, be it real vaccines or Phalanx. We also get a civilian point of view of how Solanum managed to succeed the way it did. Mary Jo Miller now lives in a purpose-built zombie-proof town. 20-foot walls of concrete with watchtowers, houses on stilts with retractable staircases, and solar panel roofs are the future of New America. But back in the day, she lived in San Diego. Her reasons for not becoming a doomsday prepper were presumably the same as everyone else's. She didn't believe it was that serious, and she had other worries. Miller had loans and repayments, and the pool had a crack in it, and the kids needed school stuff, and her husband's parents were coming over, and the dog had worms. In the time she spent watching news, what was sensationalized reports of African rabies over any other disease scare, squeezed in between the sports updates and celebrity gossip? Crucially, the winter was a huge part in subduing public fears as well. Zombies literally freeze solid, being unable to produce their own body heat. And whilst they depressingly survive this too, it does mean humanity and the rest of the world gets a reprieve in the colder seasons until they thaw. And was why Breckinridge Scott had his eye on the Antarctic base too. Unfortunately, this was an important factor to take attention away from the massing undead, and further inflate the belief in Phalanx as zombie prevalence dipped heavily in winter. Only a few continued to heed the rare warnings. For Miller, they were all on Phalanx and her husband had a gun. If African rabies was as bad as people said, that felt like it should be enough. The penny finally dropped one otherwise ordinary night. Dogs barking and car alarms going off could be considered normal on any night, but the sound of a gunshot suddenly changed the context. Months of fear, news reports and misinformation finally took solid form, and crashed through the glass of the back door. Mottled grey and stinking of the sea it had dredged itself free from, it seized Miller's husband and the two fell to the ground fighting. As she tried to find the gun, she hears the screams of her daughter. A huge zombie had seized her and was trying to pull her out through the window. No one can recount what actually happened with the panic and adrenaline, but her kids claim she pulled its head clean off in a fit of incredible hysterical strength. All Miller knows was that she managed to free her daughter. Her husband then entered with their gun. Clearly bitten by the first zombie he'd then managed to shoot. He told her to get the kids into the car and flee, and Miller heard it go off a final time as she started the engine. The bubble had popped at last. The thawed zombies had massed on towns and more rose from the sea to move into coastal areas to begin rapidly multiplying their numbers. Phalanx was busted as completely useless, and people lost faith and began taking matters into their own hands. In America, this caused a mass exodus from the cities, and especially with people trying to get north. It is this stage that was known as the Great Panic. Gavin Blair was a Fujifilm blimp pilot, and his eyes in the sky gave him a perfect view of the chaos below. Comical as it may sound, their longevity in the air, storage capacity, and all-terrain landing make blimps unbeatable in escaping a zombie horde and surviving further infestations. Blair's occupation made him very lucky indeed. He describes the scenes from the early days of the Great Panic, the highways completely full with every type of vehicle imaginable congesting the roads, people clinging to the sides and sitting on the roofs in their desperation to escape. But no one was going anywhere. Those who had abandoned their cars and were moving on foot were going faster than those in the vehicles, as they wandered and picked among the jettisoned possessions for anything they might be able to barter. The slower things got, the more the tensions ramped up, and Blair saw vicious fights from the sky that sometimes even ended in hot-tempered murder. The great tragedy was, in their blind desperation to escape, they'd just headed from one slaughterhouse to another. The congested highway in question was the I-80 between Lincoln and North Platte. They were just fleeing from one city to another, and in the early outbreaks, cities are regarded as the most dangerous places to be, with both societal breakdown and the high densities leading to masses of zombies too. Both cities were heavily infested, as well as the small towns between them as well, and when the dead spread out to hunt, their prey was now gridlocked. Blair sees the reason for panicked people ditching their cars as he watches the encroaching zombie swarm literally eat its way up the highway. Some ditched their vehicle and managed to flee in time. Others were trapped inside indefinitely, either too indecisive to run or physically rammed in between the other vehicles. Those too slow to barricade or with compromised cars were dragged out into the horde. To this day, Blair wonders about the lack of planning and the blind following of those in front that led to many getting devoured. But really, that's why it was known as the Great Panic. No one in the cars had any real plan. They just had the short-term goal of fleeing in any direction the road would let them go. For those on the I-80, it was out of the frying pan and into the fire. The Great Panic had struck all over the world, and A.J. Shah returns to Alang, the world's largest shipbreaking yard in the Indian state of Gujarat, the location of his own experiences in the Great Panic. Alang was already the world's largest ship graveyard too, and with any professional breaking having since been put on the back burner of priorities, many ships now remain to rust away. It was this that brought Shah to Alang. He knew of the association with ships, but was dismayed to find them being dismantled rather than built. But he was still hopeful he might be able to hop on a new arrival that hadn't been processed yet. Shah mentions all across the world, people within a certain proximity to the ocean fled desperately to the coast. Whether or not they had a boat, they believed fleeing to the sea was the answer. So when he got to Alang, there was already masses of people, and the shoreline was in complete chaos. He witnessed one ship attempting to drag another partly processed one out to sea. The beached one tore in half, and in a few thunderous seconds of rushing air escaping, sank with everyone on board. A sincere effort to try and help gone horribly wrong. As with the previous stages of the apocalypse, opportunists descended to profit off the chaos and fear. Some people with smaller personal or fishing vessels demanded money, supplies or possessions to either take them on board or shuttle them to the larger ships. Some of these ships had their own bargaining points, with a few only accepting women. Others only accepted light-skinned refugees, or higher members of India's caste system. Even in the last days of Rome, people were still unable to let go of their meaningless prejudices. But for every circling vulture, there were 10 more genuinely decent people risking their own lives to try and help. With the shuttlers demanding money or goods aside, there were plenty fishermen and other boat owners who could have simply fled, but instead stayed to help as many as they could. And the risk didn't just come from raiders, but from the copious undead that had followed the crowds to the shores. Not needing air, the zombies simply followed the panicked humans into the surf and submerged. People swimming for the boats would suddenly be dragged under, or capsized vessels would see their passengers disappear. But boat owners still bravely returned to the fray, and Shah even watched people leap into the water to defend seized loved ones. As the Great Panic brought out humanity's most deplorable and admirable traits all at once. Shah was one of those who tried to swim for it, and whilst lucky enough to dodge the grasping ghouls, he'd badly underestimated just how close the ships were. When he finally reached one, his stamina was drained. Worse still, there was no rope or gangway for him to actually get on. He could barely bang on the side before the last of his strength left him, and he sank below the waves. As hands grasped at his chest, he prepared for broken teeth and his end. But instead, they pulled him up rather than down, and he was hoisted aboard an ex-Coast Guard ship. His insistence that he had nothing to give but was happy to work was waved away, and he was just told to hold on as they left. Looking back, Shah believes himself as lucky. As they departed, they saw ships where zombies had either got on board or bitten people who had reanimated, with some turning into floating slaughterhouses. More still had set alight with attempts at self-defense. A helpless refugee himself, it was all Shah could do to watch the shrinking chaos as they moved out to sea. Tall and stunning, with eyes of emerald and bright red hair, Sharon could win near any beauty contest, but is barely able to spell her own name. One of the now adult feral children, Sharon is still considered one of the higher tiers in this regard, having an actual coherent thought process and fair vocabulary. Many such children were forced to live as animals for much of their lives, and never regained their true cognitive functions. Rehabilitation centres for such children sprung up after the war, to try and give such people some semblance of a human life again, but their funding has always struggled. As time passes and civilization rebuilds, their existence is threatened altogether. Sharon now lives at the Rothman Rehabilitation Home for Feral Children, although she was found in the ruins of Wichita. No one knows exactly where she came from, and her story provides little in the way of clues. Sharon was one of many who had fled with their local church, which was their first mistake. Insufficiently protected but invariably full of people, zombies often trailed fleeing humans to their churches with predictable results. Those gathered in the church were already in a bad way. Sharon's father had told her he had something to go and do, and never returned. When Sharon asks one of the mothers in the church where her daughter is, she's just met with tears. She described Pastor Dan as trying to calm everyone as he tried to contact the authorities, as tensions in the church quickly flare and arguments break out. And with the added noise come the zombies. A pack of the undead cluster around the door, and as the horde grows, it can't hold them back. The church erupted into gunfire as the zombies attacked. Sharon mentions her mother's grasp getting tighter and tighter around her throat, as she promises her daughter she won't let them get her. There's another gunshot and Sharon felt something warm spray over her face. Another pair of arms grab her and carry her like a football outside as fast as they can. As more arms pull her saviour away from her, their last words to Sharon are to run away and not stop. In Russia, any island in Lake Baikal would make for an attractive fortress, and the town of Khuzhir on Olkhon Island is where Maria Zuganova now lives out the rest of her life. Much of the Russian military didn't even know there was a Great Panic. At the same time the phalanx whistleblower piped up, their regiment underwent a forced blackout. All televisions, personal radios and phones were confiscated, and their orders modified. Initially, they were placed near the Georgian border to apparently keep the peace, when suddenly a matter of state security was at hand. They were now to question everyone in the villages if all family members were present, if family members had gone missing, or if they had been attacked by any rabid animal or man. Regardless of the answers, the questioning was invasive, with villagers being stripped down and searched intensively, although the rank and file were never told what for. On one occasion they found a cache of weapons, and yet left every single one. The nameless, mysterious civilian who joined them, who they called Ratface, had a grim-looking meeting with the village elders afterwards, before whispering things into the ears of the officers. The lower levels were told nothing, and began to grow increasingly frustrated. No one knew what they were doing or why they were doing it. Morale began to sink and tensions rose. A boiling point was reached when they were doing their usual sweeps on a small hamlet. Whilst checks were going on, a terrified child came sprinting down the road, crying for her parents. To them, she pointed across the field to another child, staggering through the mud with arms raised and a rasping moan. Ratface ordered Petrenko, their group sniper, to take her out, and he refused. Ratface insisted, multiple times, and after each demand Petrenko refused again. Zuganova remembers him as neither the strongest or bravest, being a skinny runt of a boy, but he had a line he wouldn't cross. So Ratface strode out into the field and executed the girl himself. The team was shaken and worried at what they'd witnessed. Zuganova herself was so panicked over her family, she spent most of the next day throwing up, and was kept in the infirmary when the rest of the team went out on another patrol. She was stirred from her bunk by the commotion when they returned. Heading outside, she saw their heavy machine gunner, Akady, at the centre. He had a hooded figure on a chain leash writhing at his feet, as he bellowed his refusal to shoot civilians anymore, as well as admonishing the lies and lack of information they'd been given. Hoisting the figure up to him, he pulls the hood off, to reveal the snapping zombie underneath. He grasps it under the chin with his immense strength. To show his fellow soldiers the threat that now besieges the world, he plunges a knife into her heart to no reaction, and stabs several more times to punctuate the message that this is what they were searching for but were never told about. The crowd murmurs in surprise and shared indignation, as Akady then suggests that this is the danger that could be with their families right now, when they're busy patrolling backwater villages. The zombie slips free and bites Akady's hand, and he demolishes her with fist and heel. He pounds his chest and demands to go home, to see and protect their families as the crowd begins to roar in agreement. That it's a democracy and a free country, and they can't be kept in this prison anymore. Zuganova herself joined in, as the fear and uncertainty of the past few days boiled over into rage. The entire crowd was chanting as something whizzed over her shoulder and into Akady's eye. Tear gas canisters exploded among the crowd, and Spetsnaz units sprung from nowhere, and Zuganova's memory blacked out into unconsciousness. They were not the first unit to rebel, and the Russian military had such problems cropping up all over their outposts. Unfortunately for Zuganova and her unit, their protest occurred at the same time the government came up with their solution. The Spetsnaz lined them all up in full uniform, for a berating speech regarding their failed patriotism to the motherland. Zuganova's memory of Russia in her youth was one of an apolitical mess, and with little national sentiment, yet here they were being punished for cowardice and treachery. The commanding officer tells them if they believe democracy is a God-given right, now you're going to get your chance to practice it. What followed was the decimation, used exactly as the origins of the Roman word intended. They were split into groups of 10, and allowed to select who would be executed. They were all given stones roughly the size of their fist, and told to make their choice. Baburin, an old veteran with little chance of survival, bravely volunteered, but still stared Zuganova dead in the eye as she brings down the rock onto his face. By making them all accomplices, they bind the units not just by fear, but by guilt too. The troops gave up their freedom, and the rebellions never happened again. The only freedom they had now was to shift the blame, to claim that they were just following orders, or that they would all be shot. Despite it all, Zuganova still believes it something of a success. After all, they did never rebel again. And indeed, since the war, she has somewhat come around to the new regime of things. Now greying and carrying her 8th child, she has become essentially a broodmare for her country, being told a Russian woman's most deadly and useful weapon is her uterus. In exchange for her use, she can expect to outlive the average life expectancy for most women. Their new religious fundamentalism is just to keep the masses quiet and happy, and to give them something to believe in. No one in the higher levels really has much faith, and only allow these stories to be told as it's what they want the world to know. As Russia expands to take back former territories, annexing Belarus and making moves to Ukraine, they're concerned only with an image of strength, to cast fear and the safety that comes with carrying the biggest stick, with their mighty Tsar to rule over the new Holy Russian Empire. Whilst the Caribbean is now an orderly and tranquil place that many have moved to post-war for the same reasons they may have holidayed there in the past, there is a zone known as the Wild West Indies. specifically excluded from the rest of the islands to separate holidaygoers from their money, it facilitates a culture of chaos and debauchery. It's an environment that T. Sean Collins is most home in. Collins claims there's no real word for what he used to do, arguing that private protection makes him sound like a fat mall cop. Rather, he prefers the term mercenary, although he doesn't like that either. With friends, marriage prospects, and hobbies, he also didn't look the part, and viewed his job as like any other, with dental packages, sick days, and vacations. Just the sort of lifestyle he wanted after his earlier service, and seeing what his old friends had gone through in the Middle East. He'd rather be making big bucks guarding a celebrity or a CEO. He admits he doesn't really know or care what his client in the Great Panic did, but he knew what his plan was: provide a safe haven to the rich and famous, turning the zombie apocalypse into a big networking event to raise his image during and after the war. Actors, musicians, politicians, personalities, and what we'd now call influencers were all invited, and each one brought an entourage, with there being several assistants or stylists or publishers for every big name there. Credit where it's due to them at least. If it got them to a safe location and kept bills paid, Collins couldn't fault them for trying to keep their foot in the door. And credit where it's due to his boss as well. Even Collins had to admit he was impressed by his Long Island mansion. He'd turned it into a doomsday prepper's wonderland. Wind turbines, solar panels and backup generators for fuel, desalination plants for water, and enough tinned food to feed them for years. His own personal militia, which Collins was a part of, and high walls with motion sensors. Everything needed to ride out the apocalypse in style. Plenty cameras were set up too, but many more inside the mansion itself, each one live streaming the goings-on of the celebrities. Most clairvoyant of all, the various guests would watch news and footage of events transpiring in the Great Panic. In this case, people desperately fighting off a massing swarm in New York's 3rd Avenue, and have their reactions broadcast live to the world. In a bizarre move of rapid social evolution, reaction content arose 10 or so years early in response to the apocalypse. But the party was soon spoiled by the motion sensors going off, and not just by one figure, but hundreds. To Collins' genuine fear too, they were running. But then the reality only made Collins even more uneasy. Looking through his thermal scope, he sees hundreds of signatures. It's not the dead rushing the compound, but the living. His boss's desperation to be seen by the world has resulted in the world seeing him, and realizing just what a good setup he had. The people in the front charged the gates, several wearing huge satchels that turned out to be explosive charges, strong enough to take it right off its hinges. As they flooded the compound, chaos erupted. The true picture of the end of the world as fires broke out and gunfire filled the mansion. But much of it came from the celebrities and the invaders over the personal protection. Collins and many others had been hired to fight off the undead, not shoot desperate people trying to find a safe place to hide, being hogged by millionaires. As they charged in, he heard shouts to get the women and children to safety, and put the fires out. Collins decided enough was enough. He escaped himself and found a surfboard to paddle out to the fleeing boats too. A pair of diamond earrings should still have enough worth to book a passage, he thought. If his employers had just kept their mouths shut, everyone would have had an easy time. But for some people, if they've got it, they just had to flaunt it. Now stationed in Greenland with nowhere else really to go, Ahmad Faranakian was formerly a major of the Iranian Air Force, making him privy, and partially responsible, for the devastating events that transpired there. Iran itself wasn't hard hit by Solanum. A comparatively small population, and the mountainous terrain had helped keep the growing hordes out, and limit those that got in. The threat was the fleeing refugees from the east. Millions rushed in from Baluchistan, being followed by the huge packs of stragglers converted to zombies that overwhelmed Iran's border guards. Many came from India or even further east, and Iran demanded Pakistan to take control, to which they were assured they were doing everything they could. Faranakian doesn't believe them, even now. and believes they were simply letting them go through so easily to make it someone else's problem. Apparently there were some plans to try and cooperate with the combined refugee and undead crisis, but generals claimed any Iranian soldiers on Pakistani soil was a declaration of war, and the plan was annexed. But Iran still insisted on defending itself. The duty was given to Faranakian. A single bridge over the River Ketch was responsible for 60% of their incoming traffic, and closing it would be a major relief to the crisis. Even on the approach, he could see firefights on the bridge, from refugees struggling with the massing ghouls. Faranakian targeted the centre and deployed his ordnance. He hoped that Pakistan wouldn't retaliate, and such hopes went as well as many in the Great Panic. 3 hours later, one of their garrisons shot up an Irani border station. That was fine. An eye for an eye. Now they'd made their assault, Pakistan had got revenge, and they could both move on. If only. The same colonel initially responsible for their liaison, who had annexed to the earlier plan, had ended himself, and destroyed the codes and radios rather than share state secrets. Every hour the conflict escalated, until they had 3 days of full-blown conventional warfare, with airstrikes and border clashes. Finally, it went nuclear, and each side obliterated the other's major cities. With everything going on, there was no capability to count the dead, or consider the fallout to neighbouring countries. Faranakian still considers that no one could have foreseen such an outcome, just like how no one could have foreseen the dead arising either. If there was one battle that provided a watershed moment for the early stages of the war, it was Yonkers. Set in a small New York suburb, it would shape everything in coming months, and Todd Wayno was on the front lines to see it go down. Much like after the Canadian wildfires, the sky was dense in orange with the amount of smoke from assorted disasters and civilian survival attempts. The Great Panic was out of control, and the government needed to restore order and fast. Yonkers was their attempt, a single decisive battle to show the world and their people they still had a lid on things, and the undead threat was no match for the might of the US Army. As such, the battlefield was full of press, with Yonkers having the highest press-to-military ratio of any battle in human history. Vans of reporters were everywhere, and the sky was crowded with filming helicopters. Set in the Sawmill River Parkway, the area acted as a natural choke point, and this has since been viewed near universally as the only good decision made that day. The troops were placed behind sandbags and in fighting holes, despite the fact their opponent just used teeth and nails. The first of many useless displays of typical tactical warfare for the press. That and all the gear. Tanks, mortars, Bradleys, Humvees with 50 cals, Stinger air-to-surface missiles, all the latest toys from the Middle East for them to show off. The soldiers themselves too were dressed head to toe in Mop 4. Gas mask and body armour to make them look every inch the fearless, deathless killing machine the army wanted to be known as. And on top of that, the Land Warrior Integrated Soldier System, an eyepiece and series of mounted cameras that allowed you to see through the weapons and eyes of others in your unit, as well as your position in a GPS map. Each soldier became their own command post, as well as being linked to one, so the entire battle could be seen and directed by all. Covered in armour and a cloying mask after hours of physical labour in the summer sun, Wayno is still impressed he was even still standing when the undead finally arrived. They started as a trickle, barely 50 in total as they staggered through the abandoned cars. They entered the first kill zone, and the multiple rocket launchers struck first blood in the Battle of Yonkers. The launched devices split into smaller bomblets that shredded the horde and detonated the cars into tiny volcanoes, sending metal shrapnel everywhere. It was a rush. First contact and barely any standing after it. But with that said, there were still some standing. The insides were obliterated, but all they needed was the head to be missed and they could still keep lurching forward. And now more were coming. The trickle was now a fast-flowing stream, as the vanguard of the main swarm truly reached them. Their second steel rain had even less effect, the tightly packed ghouls shielding each other from the shrapnel and reducing the momentum of the bomblets. But not to worry, that was only the first kill zone. The paladins then opened fire, but to even less effect. With their blood congealed, the viscous fluid now transferred less momentum than usual, as well as the fact it only had to affect the brain to be useful, combined with no nervous system to damage, and ballistic trauma being mostly useless. The bombardment had a fraction of the effect it would on the living. Direct hits still blew immediate zombies to pieces, but not as many as needed. The stream was now a river in full flow, and it had entered the third kill zone. This was tanks, Humvees and other heavy arms, and it finally seemed to be getting somewhere. The area became thick with an organic mist, as tens of thousands of zombies were shredded into aerosol and paste by a selection platter of explosive rounds. Tens of thousands down, over 3 million to go. After the initial explosive entry, things began to peter out. The tanks had only been equipped with 3 canister rounds, the rest were heat and sabot. As soldiers watched 60-ton tanks firing armour-piercing projectiles into the massing horde with next to no avail, the bought morale began to falter. The zombies didn't though, with no break in their numbers, and now it was time for Wayno and the rest to pitch in. They had entered the infantry kill zone. Wayno now had to ignore years of training to aim for the chest, and instead pull off perfect headshots every time, on an enemy that shouldn't exist that he'd just seen walking through a molten inferno of lead. With the standard issue automatic weapons, the infantry were poorly equipped to fight the undead too. Whilst technically impressive and good for suppressive fire, they were a waste of ammo against the undead, who only needed headshots to take them out, overall leading to more time reloading with less zombies slain per magazine. Many ideas of how to use them over the years also didn't hold out against reality, like scything through a horde by spraying at head height, which doesn't count for the varying heights of the people the zombies used to be. With Wayno being a sore gunner, he and the rest were ultimately fighting a slow uphill struggle against the advancing horde. But he and the rest of the unit were still determined to make them pay for every inch gained. What really began to crack them was the land warrior system. Be it the spybird uplink showing them that they were still just cutting the head off a snake of undead that led all the way back to Times Square, every panicked deserter screaming into the mic, everyone who missed or only grazed a target and claimed they couldn't be killed by headshots, or the unfortunate whose dropped gun camera was at the perfect angle to broadcast him being eaten alive to everyone else on the ground. Wayno's superiors shut Land Warrior down and deployed their airstrike. This time there's no organic cloud, just stillness at last. Stillness in a thick black smoke that covered everything. Then they finally came again. Some stumbling, some crawling, some still burning, some even dragging themselves with just their arms, to say nothing of the more than 1 million that the airstrike hadn't even touched. That was the final straw, and the line broke. Press and military alike fled as the undead poured in amongst their ranks. News choppers collided and showered the soldiers with their own taste of steel rain, and tanks flattened anything in their path, fleeing the oncoming horde. Wayno took a round to the sternum, mercifully stopped by his body armour, but was winded when a flashbang went off next to him. Hands grasped at him and he did everything he could to fight back, until finally one punched him in the face. Luckily for him, the dead don't punch, and he was being dragged into a Bradley to escape. The last thing he can remember is the Bradley being flung off the road by a searing blast. The military had called an end to things, and dropped a thermobaric weapon onto the swarm, one of such magnitude that the resulting rarefaction after the initial pressure wave sucked the lungs clean from a zombie's chest if they weren't incinerated. Yonkers was meant to be the day of triumph, the end to the Great Panic, and the restoration of order to America at least, but everything had backfired. In their efforts to show off their strength and ability to shock and awe an enemy that had no concept of intimidation or fear, they had only terrified their own forces and people by showing off just what an implacable foe they had, that would never stop coming and that would never feel fear, no matter how many were destroyed. They succeeded in one thing though. If the Great Panic was the final struggles of civilization, as it tried to flee and reorganize, then the Great Panic was over. Living in an undead world had begun. But would a zombie plague ever reach the numbers necessary for an event like the Battle of Yonkers to ever happen? How likely is it for an apocalyptic scenario, or even just the huge hordes so common in zombie media? And the answer is very likely, it seems. Mathematical modelling with zombies is something of a popular subgenre of modelling, with some universities using it as a training course to start students off with concepts in modelling, and there are numerous publications on the subject, as well as responses to said publications too. The chief conclusion of many such papers is that the prognosis for humans isn't great, and action needs to be taken near instantly at the start of the plague to combat the undead successfully. The first paper, by Munns, found that humanity typically loses without extreme and early action, and the notion of a cure, a rare one in zombie fiction, could potentially prolong humans to survive in an infected world, but wouldn't stop apocalyptic levels of zombies. This paper was criticised by some, but then they ultimately found the same results anyway, if not perhaps quite as swift or severe a loss for humanity. An online source found humanity was almost invariably exterminated by the undead, unless they deliberately and extremely skewed the parameters to let humanity win. So ultimately, despite government officials' pride over its alpha teams, they were nothing but a flawed concept in hindsight. There should ideally be no notion of slowing an infection, but rather flinging your full strength at it as soon as it arrives, to crush it before it can spread. By the time you're discussing firefighting, damage control and stopgap measures, you've ultimately already lost. Interestingly, the plan for the second phase mentioned by D'Ambrosia, to arm and train the population, is perhaps the best idea. Another paper that tested various different models found that the most successful way to stop an uprising was to have an armed and skilled civilian populace ready to take on the zombies. Many may think this means America, with its love of firearms, should steamroll the decaying masses, but there's a considerable difference between owning a gun and actually being sufficiently trained to use it in combat, let alone against the undead, as Yonkers shows. Max Brooks has another short story, Stephen Fred, about a useless idiot who locks himself in a toilet and eventually dies of starvation and malnutrition. He spends his final hours locked in a cubicle, rereading the comics of his favourite Literally Me character, which is likely the end for most people who think owning a gun means they can solo a zombie apocalypse. The role of a strong military can also influence things, but military intervention has to happen urgently at the start of the outbreak, or models find it ultimately won't be enough to fight back the hordes, and that most countries don't actually have large or well-funded enough militaries to do so. Interestingly too, as said last time, the zombies being too competent actually works against them. Zombies that were made more dangerous and effective predators ultimately devoured too much of the populace without converting them, and thus limited their own numbers too much, resulting in their eventual defeat. In other zombie media, one could argue this is why lethal mutated zombies, like Special Infected, only form a small proportion of the undead populace overall, so they don't wipe out too much of their potential stock. Obviously, models aren't real life, and there's still some stumbling blocks that a zombie plague could well come up against, that may not make things quite as simple as the near-flawless victories often produced for them. But with that said, the maths isn't very convincing of our chances in a real uprising, with so many sources typically coming to the same conclusion. There's also considerable real-life precedent to back this up as well. In our own pandemic, luckily not a zombie one, there were significantly more deaths in countries with less stringent COVID restrictions, and considerable variance in government policies in response to COVID itself. Many world leaders reacted with a slow, sluggish response, the exact one that would lead to humanity's downfall. And for a virus like Solanum, the similarly lethargic response many governments were seen to react with in the zombie war isn't out of character or unreasonable at all. The greatest failing across many nations was refusing to take the threat seriously until it was on their doorstep, with half the already turned populace shambling behind them. The question now was how to survive in an undead world. Thanks for watching, and thanks as ever to my patrons: Phenomenon, The Superis Duper, Sam Burgo, Sonam Lobsung, K Sandom, Big Al, Eringar Steiny, Flagon's Archives, Hui Hui, Original Username, Tristan Berry, Evely, Howleth, Archerzor Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu for their ongoing support to the channel. If you're enjoying this series so far and would like to contribute, a link is provided in the description, and any amount is always appreciated. If not, the usual of likes and comments are as well, and especially shares to others who may enjoy this content too. For any series outside my usual content, it's definitely needed. So on that note, thanks to all who watched the last video, be it from just needing background noise or actually being interested in general. I'm also quite pleased to hear just how many enjoyed it who had read the book themselves prior, so it's good to know I wasn't just wasting time retelling it. Some chapters do have inherently more to work with analysis-wise than others, and the next video is admittedly pretty light on that, but the rest have plenty more assorted topics to dig into. Also, I'm relieved to see no one minded the relatively simplistic visual style of the videos so far. Relevant artwork is pretty hard to find, and I'm fairly certain most of it will be used as is. Although if anyone has any art for World War Z, or would like to make pieces to be featured, please do get in contact for future videos. Many did also point out how certain aspects of the book have aged poorly, and I definitely agree. Even with one of the lighter things like just the phalanx situation, the notion of a vaccine doing too well is now very much a 2000s idea. But if nothing else, it shows that dark as parts of the books get, Brooks is still clearly an optimist. And it is interesting to ponder on that note what World War Z would look like if it was written in 2024. But I still don't think that diminishes it as a narrative. A good story doesn't need to predict the future, and World War Z is still a great one regardless. So hopefully people enjoyed this, although it may be worth noting over the years some have been critical of Yonkers, saying that even in the late 2000s the US should have still stomped 3 million zombies. Possibly, but it's worth noting that this necessarily wasn't the point of that chapter, which is more a lack of preparation and a desire to show off, rather than just a swift and efficient battle that wasn't as showy. But other takes on it are always still appreciated. And, if you have your own small channel analysing such things especially, by all means please do let me know. Even with the US Army, the simulations still support a zombie victory, even if the blow-by-blow of Yonkers may not necessarily be how it happens. And I think a crucial part many do forget is that the military both underestimated the zombies and openly wanted to use it as a showboating opportunity, and one that presumably didn't damage nearby infrastructure, especially of their largest and most famous city, rather than a quick and efficient stomp. The military also did arguably win, with their thermobaric weapon after all, but the biggest impact wasn't from the combat, but was from the fact the army had their morale destroyed, and that the public lost all faith in the military and government to protect them, leading to a national societal meltdown. The army was still intact enough to pull back to the Rockies, and plenty people did too. So it's not like the zombies just ate the military. It's much more the behavioural and societal impacts, and the ripple effects from them, that were much more prevalent in the narrative overall, instead of the amount of zombies slain or not, which I think can get a bit glossed over when critiquing the battle. But hopefully people enjoyed this video too regardless, and will stay tuned for the rest of the series as well.